We'll wait till we are officially live here. Good morning to everybody. And I guess it's now afternoon, technically. All right. Well, it has been 3 weeks since our last Mythic Mission episode, and we're coming back with a bang with our guest today. So hello and good morning and good afternoon to everybody who's joining us on Facebook land and elsewhere. As you know, my name is Professor Michael Jahoski. Many of you are family, friends, acquaintances. I hope you'll tune in. And if you can, send in some questions. If we have time towards the end of today's packed interview, we'll try to see if we can get to a few. If not, just sit back, enjoy the conversation. Let me introduce my guest for episode 30. I had to look at this today and say, wow, we've done 30 episodes in 8 months. Episode 30 of Mythic Mission is called Christianity CrossExamined. And my interview today is with Professor Ken Samples. So let me go ahead and introduce my guest, and then we'll get started with our show today. I'm excited to tell you what we're going to be talking about. Philosopher and theologian Kenneth Richard Samples is a senior research scholar at Reasons to Believe. Ken is an experienced educator who has taught courses in philosophy and religion at several schools and is currently an adjunct instructor of apologetics at Biola University. Kenneth seeks to encourage Christians to develop a logically defensible faith and challenges skeptics to engage Christianity at a philosophical worldview level. His books, which we're going to be discussing this one today, include Christianity CrossExamined, his newest book, if I'm not mistaken, Classic Christian Thinkers, and one of my favorites, God Among Sages. Professor Samples' books, I've mentioned this on Facebook several times, have been a blessing to me over the years. I've told him they've been very helpful. I'm very honored and excited to have him on the show today. We're going to be discussing a variety of subjects. We're going to try to get to them all. Let me give you just a foretaste of some of those subjects. We're going to be talking foremost about the relationship between science and religion. We'll be getting into that extensively, but talking also about the nature of faith, what a mystery is versus a contradiction. These two often get conflated. Just war theory, which is something I'm very much looking forward to. We'll weave in some, common misconceptions about things like the Crusades, for example. Religious pluralism, if you're not familiar with what that is, I think you'll leave today's episode with a better understanding and much more. Professor Samples, thank you so much for joining me today. It is an honor to have you on.
Michael, it's good to see you and talk with you. You've been a Facebook friend, and I've always heard good things about your work. And so it's my pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Been very much looking forward to it. So as I like to ask all my guests, again, when we get started, just if you can, I know we're going to be diving into your book, but why did you become a Christian? I mean, today, religion is increasingly viewed as something that people can choose, like their favorite ice cream flavor. We'll get into this later, oh, I'm this and I'm that. But, this is a very serious commitment. And I know that we take it seriously. So why Christianity and not Buddhism or atheism or any of the other worldviews?
Yes, well, my parents were evangelical Christians, and then in the early 1960s, they converted to Catholicism. My dad was a World War II veteran. He was in Rome when the city was liberated by the Allies, and I think it just had an influence on him. And so as a 4-year-old, I was baptized in Southern California, a parish named after St. Athanasius.
Mm-hmm.
And so my Catholicism was important to me, but as I became a teenager, I wasn't very serious about either Catholicism or kind of Christianity as a whole. But when I was early in college, we had a very difficult experience in our family. My brother, after a long period of mental health issues and drug addiction, my brother took his life, and that just knocked me down. I started searching. I had been in the process, but my sister gave me a book by C.S. Lewis entitled Mere Christianity, and I read it, and I was so impressed with it, with the clarity of it, with the intellectual reflectiveness, and I embraced it. And for a while, I continued attending the Catholic Church when I met Walter Martin, who was a distinguished apologist in the area of new religious movements. And I decided to become an evangelical Protestant. And so that all took place in the late 70s, early 80s.
Mm, okay. Well, I'm very sorry to hear about your brother. You know, aside from that very sad fact, we do have some other things in common with your father. And I saw you just posted something recently about this. I think he passed away the year I was born in 1985.
Yeah,
My grandfather, as you know, was a World War II vet and was in
yes.
a different theater of the war, but you know, passed away in 1994 on Veterans Day, no less.
Wow.
You know, very powerful stuff. When we talk about just war theory later on today, I think it'll be great to bring up World War II. Thank you for sharing your story. We also have something else in common. I was baptized and raised in the Catholic Church for many years, and then
Okay.
you know, tell my story in my book. But you know, have kind of wandered between the branches. So
Yep. Yep.
very common experience. I'm getting a sense from a lot of Christians who are trying to find, like Lewis said in I think Mere Christianity, we're in the hallway, we're trying to find the
Yeah.
door.
What a great picture he gives us of that.
Yes, it is. So thank you again for sharing. Why don't you tell us why you wrote this new book, Christianity Cross-Examined, then we'll get into some of those great questions we have.
Yeah, I think, with all of my books, Michael, I think I kind of carry them around in my mind for a decade or two. I remember when I was working with Walter Martin at the Christian Research Institute in the late 80s, when I would go to the university, the academy, and give a talk either to faculty or to the students.
Mhm.
I got all truth questions in those days. Does God exist? Was Jesus the Son of God? Did he rise from the dead? There was questions about why Jesus instead of Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad. Um, Moving ahead, however, 35 years and working at Reasons to Believe with Hugh Ross, I noticed about 10 or 15 years ago that when we would go to the college campus, the kinds of questions students asked me were changing. I
Mm,
still get and got truth questions, but there was an increasing amount of, well, has Christianity been a good force in the world? Has it been good for women? Has it been good for racial minorities? And I thought, wow, it seems like I'm seeing a different type of question. Maybe philosophers would say moving from questions of modernity to postmodernity.
mm,
But I began thinking that maybe what we need in apologetics is not to address just the truth claims of Christianity, but also to remind people that Christianity has been a good force in the world. And so
mm.
at that point, I decided that I would work on a book. And in fact, Michael, I would even say, I think, and this is, of course, a paradigm. Every atheist doesn't fit into this category, exactly. But I noticed that there are some atheists who would say, for example, that, maybe God existing wouldn't be a bad thing. Maybe I
Mhm.
would survive the death of my body. Maybe I would be united with my loved ones. But the problem is, it's not rational.
Mm.
Then there's another atheist who comes along and says, no, there are arguments for God. In fact, some of the brightest people tend to be religious, but I don't want that God to exist. And I thought, well, I'd like to write a book that might address both of those types of atheists and would look at both the rationality and the goodness of our faith.
Beautiful. I think that's so important. And I don't nearly have as much experience, but I've noticed just in the decade I've been teaching at college, the questions are changing. And I think Paul Gould put it in his book, Cultural Apologetics. You know, so God exists or he doesn't. Who cares? Let's go have beer and pizza. And I get a sense that that's the resignation sometimes. And I think it comes from a place where people are bored sometimes with the rational arguments, the logical arguments, the truth questions, and they want the aesthetic and the ethical dimensions.
Yeah.
You know, like you, I will be here to admit, I don't think those are unimportant, the truth questions, but certainly there's been a shift, a paradigm, shift of some sort. And so I think it's great that you've written it for that reason. And I'm grateful for the book and for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I think it's time we start diving into the questions. I've kind of hopped around, as you know, with your book. There's so much here, and I have to say it's some of the finest writing I've seen on the subjects, because sometimes they, even over my head, and I read a lot and dabble in this and consider myself an apologist, and some of the books can become very hard to read.
Yeah.
But there's so much breadth here that you have, and you go into it very clearly and deeply for us. So I've tried to to be selective because
Sure.
there's just so much that I wanted to ask you we won't have time for. So I hope that our audience will appreciate some of the focal points I've chosen for today. And the first two chapters, I think, are really crucial because this is one of those questions, and it still has to do with the realm of truth, but it's still one that I hear a lot, and that has to do with the relationship and the so-called war between science and religion in general. And so chapter one, my first question for chapter one, and chapter one of your book is called, "Hasn't Scientific Discovery Made God Unnecessary?" So is there really a long-standing war between science and Christianity specifically, or religion generally?
Yeah, I think that this is a misunderstanding. I mean, it's certainly true that since the time of Galileo and afterward, there have been conflicts between kind of the religious perspective and the scientific point of view. But I think, Michael, in the long run, Christianity and science, or religion and science in the West, they've existed, and I think were more often allies than they were enemies. And so this kind of warfare perspective, I think it's been largely shown to be false. There are some good science historians like Ronald Numbers. Paul Davies even approaches this question. And there is a fairly recent book by James Hannam, and interesting title. He says it's the genesis of science, and the subtitle is How the Christian Middle Ages Launched the Scientific Revolution.
Oh, wow.
So, and he makes interesting comments. Here's a couple brief quotes. He says, "It's probably imagined that the history of science and religion is one of violent conflict, but the facts don't bear this out." And then he says, "The conflict between science and creation is real enough, but it is the exception, not the rule. For most of history, science and religion have rubbed along just fine." So, there are people living today, I think of Jerry Coyne and Lawrence Krauss, and certainly Richard Dawkins. They like to kind of give you a warfare narrative, but I don't think that that's accurate.
No, I quite agree. And I made some notes here, just some things to keep us talking on this point. I think you mentioned there's almost sort of like a double standard, especially too with the eternal nature of the universe. And if the universe were eternal, there's no need theoretically to have a causal explanation. But atheists often fail to understand. I think you say that if God exists as an eternal and necessary being, then he also does not need a causal explanation. So that's one of the topics that came out in chapter one that I think illustrates this. That's one of the things that I think people fight over or perceive that religion and science are fighting over.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes working at Reasons to Believe has taught me, Michael, that scientists and philosophers, or scientists and theologians, we have different training and we ask different kinds of questions. And I've noticed through the years, it's easy for those people to kind of talk past one another. And I've heard many statements by Stephen Hawking, by Lawrence Krauss, and they kind of speculate philosophically, but it's not a well-formed philosophical thought. And absolutely true. I mean, if the universe were in fact eternal, then I don't think we'd have to ask, what came before that. But it's also true that if God is indeed eternal, he would be, an ultimate in himself.
Yeah, and we'll see later in the interview. You're right. I think that atheists in particular still want to find some way to explain that away. The idea that God is eternal, that there's a way to appeal to the multiverse theory, or to maybe there's got to be a cause for God, and it almost seems that they overlook the infinite regress that Aristotle talked about too.
Yeah.
So there's really, I think the key word here is there's a lot of talking past the disciplines, and talking past one another in the disciplines, and a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding. And often find, a lot of my students have like little sound bites that they pick up and they latch onto those. And most of them mean well. And then when they hear, well, that's not sound thinking, and this is a confusion of that, they're willing to kind of give that up and say, let me look at it again. So I think, I wish just more of the general public got this information so they would be informed. That way we could have these important conversations together.
Yeah.
So the next question kind of is logically flows from the first. Can we talk about just some of the cosmological evidence? Here I'm thinking of maybe the anthropic principle,
Yeah.
fine-tuning that further supports the truthfulness and capaciousness of the Christian worldview.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt, Michael, today, the idea of a fine-tuned universe is no longer controversial.
Mm.
Uh, Virtually all of science recognizes that we live in a universe where its laws, its initial conditions, the
Mhm.
fundamental parameters of the universe, they're all precisely calibrated or fine-tuned. And the most interesting kind of analogy is, if you had a control panel, you'd have to have all of these dials dialed in just right. If they were a little stronger or weaker, no life would be possible at all. And it's amazing when you look at things like the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, all of them have to be just right. And my colleague, Hugh Ross, who is my boss at RTB, he even develops it further, where it's not just the initial conditions of the universe, but the right galaxy, the right star, the habitable zone within our solar system. There's a book came out a few years ago about rare earth, that earth has to have certain qualities. So maybe these ideas of planets, extrasolar planets outside of our solar system, um, they may be much more rare than people think. And so
Mm.
I think that this is a very powerful argument. Now, nobody doubts the fine tuning. The question is, how do we account for it?
Mm.
Did it have to be that way? Is it necessity? Paul Davies would say no. Paul Davies is a leading physicist and cosmologist. Did we just get lucky? Well, some of the statistics indicate that that kind of probability is beyond our grasp. And
Extraordinary.
therefore, was it God? And of course, that leads into the question of the multiverse. Could the universe have had some beginning with additional universes, or the many worlds hypothesis, as it's called?
Yeah, no, I'm very convinced by it. And I know that, the kind of a critical rationalist perspective means that there's always a way to say, well, we don't have, comprehensive evidence for this. We can always find a way to be skeptical of the data. But I find what you say later in the book about, abductive reasoning versus, and I don't mean versus, but, as opposed to deductive and inductive, it's the inference to the best explanation that we use in the sciences. And I think it really fits here, because you've got some extraordinary facts that you have to explain if it isn't God. I mean, and we're just scratching the surface here. So in light of all the other mountain of things that you talk about in chapters 1 and 2, you'd have to really do a lot of explaining here.
And I think abductive reasoning, I mean, both of us appreciate and admire the approach that C.S. Lewis takes. I think that abductive approach, I mean, it explains the origin of the universe, the complexity of the universe. It explains ethics. It explains beauty. It explains as Pascal would say, our greatness and wretchedness.
Mm.
I think that's a remarkable way of approaching. And I've even thought to myself, if somebody came to me and said, Ken, why do you believe? What's the fundamental reason that you believe? I think I would say because historic Christianity does the best job of explaining the most meaningful realities of life.
Yes, and it makes sense of the sciences. I mean, as opposed to
Right.
fitting the sciences into other worldviews, and how does this work? And now I would agree there are other worldviews in which it would fit into Islam, for example,
Yeah.
but Christianity offers the best explanation. I think inference is the best explanation there. So it's an interesting exercise to do that when, fitting it in with other worldviews and traditions from history. So I agree with you. I would answer it the same way. There's some other really great topics in chapter 1 that I want to get to. So I by no means we have said the final word. We'll have to probably have you on the show again to talk more. One of the favorite sections I had is you talk about Neil deGrasse Tyson, because he's very popular with my college students, and I've watched a few of his shows and his talks. And I remember some bumper sticker I saw on somebody's car down in St. Pete. I was driving, that it was from him. It was about the great thing about science is it's true whether you think it or not, something along those lines.
Right.
And you talk about his comments here at the end of chapter 1. about the teleological, the purpose of the universe. So can we talk a little bit about that? Because it's very
Sure.
interesting.
Yeah, in 2012, he did a little video that's still available on YouTube where he answers the question, did the universe have a purpose?
That's it.
And he ultimately says something along these lines. He says, well, we don't know for sure, but it doesn't appear. It seems like the evidence against the universe having a purpose is very strong. And then he makes certain comments. He says, anybody who thinks differently is not being driven by empirical observations. And the more I kind of worked through that, the more I realized that there was faulty reasoning. I mean, I like Neil deGrasse Tyson because number one, he's an astute scientist, but I also like him because he does a good job of kind of popularizing science. He speaks to people, who don't have an expanded background in math. But he says some things that I think are faulty. For example, he says that the universe doesn't have a purpose unless you have an agenda. You have a worldview that you're kind of butting into things. And I think to myself, well, Dr. Tyson, you also have a worldview. You also have, if I have an agenda, you have an agenda. And I think he fails to realize that we're all claiming to have a perspective. So I kind of critique the logic and what is in that video, and I know that video has gone all over the place. So I wanted to be able to have a response.
It's a great response, and in it, if I could just add two things to what you've already said excellently. You quote C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity, one of our favorite books. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. You really got to think about that one, folks. But it's exactly as Ken said. Tyson also is kind of smuggling a worldview into this, and I feel like he has to know this, that science does depend upon certain non-scientific philosophical truths and assumptions. It's almost as if he's ignorant of that, but I can't imagine somebody like with his education would be.
Michael, it's interesting to me. Again, anytime I've met scientists through reasons to believe, I always have a question. I say, why does science work? And almost all of them have said, I don't know, it just does. I was in a debate up in Fresno with a professor at Fresno State University, a very intellectual school. And the professor said to me, he said during our radio debate, he said, as a scientist, I have no beliefs. And I couldn't wait for my time because I said, look, don't you believe there's a real world out there, a mind-independent world? Don't you believe that math and logic are viable? Don't you believe you have cognitive faculties and sensory organs that work? I said, you have lots of beliefs. And I think, Michael, a lot of times scientists are not aware that science doesn't work in a neutral or independent way from worldview ideas.
That's it.
They have a specialized training, and it doesn't involve metaphysics or epistemology often.
And that's understandable. I mean, certainly I don't have a training in advanced mathematics or the sciences.
Absolutely.
So how could I be expected to? And a certain familiarity with ideas is expected, I think, of everybody, a general education, but I can certainly forgive that. And I don't think he meant it obviously maliciously, it just seemed like something he was perhaps unaware. But it's interesting. It's a great response in chapter 1. I hope people will take the time to read it carefully because there's much more that you say. And I want to move on to chapter 2. And if we have some time, we can circle back to some other topics, maybe consciousness, which was my last question, can get worked in somewhere else. So chapter 2 is called Who Needs Faith When We've Got Science? Great titles for the chapters. I love. They're common questions that we often hear as Christians. So here's exactly a great segue. Is science intellectually neutral? Is it somehow more objective than religion? That's my first question.
Yeah, and that's a very common idea. What I do in the book is I say, look, for science to work, you have to have a world that's conducive to science. It has to be a real world. It also has to have intelligibility. So you need the right world. I don't think Hinduism or certain other worldviews provide a cosmos that is conducive to science. But you not only have to have the right kind of world, a world that has patterns and regularity, that's intelligible, but you also have to have the right observer, the right human being. We have to be able to trust our cognitive faculties. We also have to be networked. So you need the right world, the right observer, and then some congruence like math, like logic. Well, all of this fits really well in kind of a Judeo-Christian worldview. But I think it's reasonable, Michael, to ask if naturalism had been the dominating paradigm, would science have arisen? I think that's a fair question. And so science is not independent of worldview ideas. I would say science, as we know it, emerging in the 1600s in Christian Europe, I would say that science is dependent upon both philosophy and theology.
Right? As you say, certain non-scientific assumptions, and you talk about the objective reality of the cosmos, the basic intelligibility of the cosmos, the order, regularity, and uniformity of nature, the reliable effectiveness of math and logic, and so on and so forth. The congruence is a really important idea. And so that our audience doesn't misunderstand, we're not attacking adherents of these religions. We're saying that certain ideas in the sciences and the humanities, you might say too, won't fit in within certain worldview systems because there is no interior idea that gives coherence and explanatory power for these sorts of realities. And so, for example, you mentioned Hinduism, the idea in Hinduism and Buddhism, at least certain branches of Hinduism, there's no self. And in Buddhism, the idea of, an anatta or anatman, without a soul, these have an effect on how we explain the observer. And if there's nobody observing, then who can do any observing? So these are the kinds of things that I think you mean. And I think it's important people understand that, this is not a criticism of people who are made in the image of God, but ideas that don't make sense of these other scientific observations. I think that's very powerful.
In fact, Stanley Yaki, who is a physicist and a philosopher, a Catholic thinker, he has argued that worldview ideas inhibit the development of science. And I think that's true. I mean, if the world is an illusion, or if human beings don't have the capacity to track the intelligibility of the universe, these are impediments to the birth and advance of science.
That's very well said. And I couldn't agree more. Very, very important idea, and really beautifully explained in chapter 2. The other thing I think that emerges from this conversation is we've talked about science and the scientific methods. There's various methods, there's various branches of the sciences. I don't know that a lot of people are familiar as we are with scientism, which is an extreme philosophical position. You mentioned naturalism. They're not the same thing, but they're equated. They're similar. Can you explain, you give a distinction between strong scientism and weak scientism in chapter 2?
A strong scientism would say that that knowledge can only come from the sciences. Only empirically derived knowledge is real knowledge. A more modest approach to that would say that maybe scientific knowledge is the best, or it's superior. I remember Lawrence Krauss, again, a very articulate physicist who's debated various Christian thinkers. Lawrence Krauss made the statement that experiment is the final court of appeals for truth. And I thought to myself immediately, well, what experiment gave him that? That seems more like a starting point and an assumption. So many Christian apologists have critiqued scientism. I mean, there's also knowledge philosophically. There is potential religious knowledge. I think Christians should respect and admire science and see the benefits that have derived from it, but it has real limitations.
Absolutely. And I think you would agree perhaps that religion by itself also has certain limitations, and
Indeed.
Fundamentalism is a real threat, and aberrations of worldviews and corruptions of Christianity have existed, and we talk about heresies. So I think it's important people realize that there's that consilience that Alistair E. McGrath talks about, those weaving together of multiple disciplines. I get the impression from a lot of my science track students who are earning their AS that might kind of say, oh, well, that makes sense that this is the only way to knowledge. And I'm thinking, what a boring, flattened world we would live in if science is the only means or the best possible means of explaining. I don't know why we can't have it both ways. As you said in chapter 1, there's always been a relationship, a positive relationship, or not always, but there has frequently, more often than not, been a positive relationship between the two. So very good. Okay, one or two last things in chapter 2, and then we'll talk about faith and reason, which is a really great subject I'm sure people are interested to hear about. So towards the end of chapter 2, you list several things that science by itself has a hard time explaining. Again, perfect segue from where we just were. Could you just unpack a few of those for us? I mean, for example, you mentioned logic, ethics, etc.
Yeah, echoing back to World War II, I mean, the scientists at the time were able to develop atomic weapons, but that science that helped them to split the atom couldn't tell them whether it should be utilized, how these atomic weapons should be utilized. I mean, this is the area of the limitations of the science. Science has lengthened our lifespan. I mean, think of the medications. Think of the benefits that are derived, particularly from medicine and technology. But when it comes to metaphysical questions, like what's the ultimate nature of reality? Are there other minds in the universe? Or how should we live our life? What's the purpose of life? How do we detect beauty? And then, of course, even science itself. I mean, there are all these assumptions. We begin with math and logic. We don't derive math and logic from science. So I'm not beating up on science when I say it is a masterful discipline, but it has real limits. When it stays within the limits, it's amazing. If you exaggerate it, it becomes convoluted.
Wow. Yes. Beautifully said. And I love that last point. The scientific venture itself, you say, I mean, science really can't appeal to itself to justify itself, to give warrant for belief in what scientific findings, are generated. So by scientists. So it's very interesting that, all of these other truths are certainly very important. Metaphysical truths, ethical truths, aesthetic, beauty-based considerations, which we don't want to overlook, logic and math, but science itself, wow, what a revelation. I think people will really appreciate that. I have to ask you about this because I get this from students all the time. It's kind of similar, I'm sure, and I can't remember exactly how it goes. Can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? That old question. Something like that has kind of happened with quantum physics and the way that light behaves in certain contexts. So, most of us are probably familiar, at least people who listen to our show, with the laws of logic, especially non-contradiction. Do the findings of quantum physics undermine the laws of logic? I mean, is this the exception to the rule?
It's really interesting. People often will ask that question. I remember giving a talk about the laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction. Something cannot both be and non-be at the same time in the same way. And there was a physicist in the audience, and he raised his hand and said, "Well, what about quantum mechanics? I mean, isn't light at sometimes a wave and another time a particle? Isn't it A and non-A?" That's a very exotic interpretation, however. If you go back to a much more traditional view of the way we understand this very mysterious realm of existence called quantum mechanics, and that should tip us off that there are mysteries, not just in religion, but also in science. But the standard interpretation, Michael, is that under certain experiments, light behaves as a particle. Under a very different set of circumstances, it behaves as a wave. I don't think that a standard approach to quantum mechanics in any way threatens the law of non-contradiction. Again, there are exotic interpretations, and it is mysterious, but I think it's easy to exaggerate what quantum mechanics is really telling us about reality.
Well, certainly. And, if I understand it correctly, this examines the very, very small parts of nature. And, that's not where we live. That's not the plane of existence upon which we live. So the way you deal with it at the end of chapter 2 is people will have to read it because you go further than we have here. I've only asked you to touch on it. So there's much more to say. And I think you offer, not a defeating sort of, answer, but one that will generate more conversation between the disciplines, which I think people who have a scientific background who are reading your book or listening to this will appreciate. So thank you for touching on that.
Sure.
Chapter 3 is, isn't faith incompatible with reason? And at first, I think, and foremost, we need to set forth a proper understanding. I think maybe it was Greg Kokel or J. Warner Wallace, or both of them have talked about the 3 different kinds of faith. And so can we define faith for our audience, what it is, what it isn't?
Yeah, I think if you look at Christian history, I mean, I have a great admiration for St. Augustine, and Augustine talks about faith seeking understanding. He gives a definition that I think then is picked up by Anselm. I think even Thomas Aquinas affirms it. I think that the Protestant reformers would agree with it. And that is that faith is confident trust in a reliable source. The word pistuo, to believe, the noun pistis, the core of it has to do with trust. But it's not blind faith. It's not trust in anything or everything. It has to be a reliable or credible source. Thus, that reliable or credible source is the resurrected Christ. It is God who is the author of creation. It may be your parents. It may be your professors. Hey, I have confident trust in sources, and so I'm putting my faith into something that I can have a reliable understanding of.
Wow. Yes, that's exactly my understanding of it as well. And I think if I remember correctly, it was Wallace who gave was it unreasonable faith, reasonable faith, and blind faith. And it's a caricature of faith. We always see it, or at least skeptics see it as blind, a belief without evidence. But that's not at all what you're saying, or what Augustine or Aquinas and others have said.
Indeed. I mean, Augustine would say, for example, that faith involves knowledge and it's compatible with reason. And what's interesting, if you define faith that way, confident trust in a reliable source, notice that reason is part of that very definition, that what philosophers call warrant or justification, there is a rational element of that faith.
Wow. Yeah, that's reminding me too of Peter Kreft's book on Christian apologetics, where he talks about faith and reason working together, and that they're both subjective acts of the mind, but they're reasoning towards an objective truth. And the way that they support and almost buttress each other, and the way you pointed that out in that definition, I think that's great. I think people will hopefully look at this term in a different light. Speaking of other terms we need to look at in a different light, probably mystery. We hear God works in mysterious ways, Ken, all the time. And my students are constantly, they'll hear me talk about what a paradox or mystery is, and they'll say, oh, that kind of just sounds like you're making a special pleading exception. Of course you would say that. But there really are some serious differences between a contradiction and a mystery. So could you go ahead and just distinguish those two again? Let's talk a little bit about mystery.
Yeah, if you think about church history, I have found, Michael, that the great Christian thinkers who wrote the creeds and developed kind of the Christian worldview, they respected both reason and mystery. They realized that God is infinite and eternal. Human beings are finite and temporal. Therefore, there are going to be things about God that are mysterious. I try to bring together the idea that a contradiction and a mystery are two different things. A contradiction, in its essence, is two ideas that negate or deny one another. A cannot equal non-A. A mystery, on the other hand, is a truth of revelation that we cannot fully or completely understand, but when we do work through it, it doesn't do any damage to reason and rationality. I illustrate, for example, that if I said Ken Samples is a human being and Ken Samples is not a human being, those two statements negate or deny one another. But if I said Jesus, the historic Jesus, had both a divine and human nature, now that's mysterious. I can't fully understand, but there have been Christian thinkers who have proposed ways of how those two natures could be in union in a single person. So a mystery is important. I mean, if God is infinite and eternal, we have to get used to the idea that there are things about him we cannot, exhaustively comprehend.
And that's a great explanation. Thank you. And I think it's important here. Maybe I mentioned, when we look at the incarnation and Christ has a human and a divine nature, I think a lot of people who might be skeptical might take the assumption that, well, science can't make sense of it and we can't rationally prove this. So that's why that's not possible. And so calling it a mystery just seems like a cop-out. It might be the accusation, but I don't think that's at all what you're saying.
No, in fact, the early church, and again, I think it shows their respect for both logic, for reason and rationality, and for mystery. They said, for example, that the divine nature doesn't, divinize the humanity, and the humanity doesn't drag down, the divinity. I think you can make, and Christian philosophers have set forth ways of thinking about it. Again, I think, though, it's important that we realize that virtually everything about God is mysterious. And if it were a God that, Michael, you and I could understand, he wouldn't be much of a God.
Mm-hmm. Was that Augustine who said, if you comprehend it, he's not God?
Yeah.
I can't remember the si comprehendus, I think, in Latin. My Latin is very rusty. That's always come to mind. And I think people really struggle with that idea, though, because I think maybe, and this is our fallen nature, we have so much confidence or overconfidence in our ability to rationally understand things. I think mystery, and maybe you mentioned this, it's something that instills humility in us. And I think that's necessary to being a scientist or a person of faith, or both.
Right.
So very good. You use some really great metaphors. The first one I really like, for the incarnation. Could we just go ahead and explain for people who are listening? We use this word a lot. I know I use it a lot in my book. Some people I've found are not familiar. What is the incarnation? And then what are the metaphors you use to explain this?
Yeah, well, of course, the word incarnation is Latin, so it's not in the New Testament, which was written in Greek. But the Greek word is sarx, that God has become flesh. The second person of the Trinity took a human nature, and so Jesus was a single person with both the divine and human nature. And I have found some of, again, because I like Augustine, I like analogies. Some people are always critical and think, don't use an analogy about the Trinity or the incarnation. I'm a little more Augustinian. I'm like, okay, well, let me evaluate it. Gerald Bray, who is an Anglican theologian, he uses the idea, and I think it's interesting. He says maybe the incarnation was like a person who has dual citizenship, who is from two nations. And he talks about the idea that these are people who might, I remember the previous prime minister of Israel, I would hear him talking in the Hebrew language, and then in a moment's notice, he would shift to English, and it was perfect English. Bray says, what if we thought of the incarnation that way, that it's like a person with two citizenships? They may go back and forth in the languages, so much so that sometimes they don't know that they've shifted. And I thought, wow, that's a very interesting way of thinking about this great truth and this mysterious truth known as the incarnation.
Beautiful.
Another one is the idea, and Paul Copan talks about this, another very thoughtful contemporary Christian philosopher. Copan talks about our conscious level and our subconscious level. We are conscious, but then there's a deeper level of the unconscious. He says, what if the incarnation were like that, where Jesus had an awareness from his divine point of view and his human point of view? And again, I find those to be provocative. Do they perfectly tell us what the incarnation is? No, but I think they're thought-provoking, and they try to make sense of this reality.
Yes, and I think we need to take metaphors seriously, because they're not making a point literally, but it is about something literal. It's about it has real truth value. So there's a lot of confusion, and I go into this in my book. So there's a rich history, but it's also often convoluted, this understanding of metaphor, that we don't take it seriously. Oh, that's just a metaphor. But metaphors are very powerful conveyors of truth, that Jesus himself relied heavily on them. Parables are, among other things, metaphorical narratives.
right.
So we need to take metaphors seriously. I have to ask though, before I finish out chapter 3 and move on to chapter 4, people ask me all the time, did Jesus know he was God? And so this gets into the divine and human nature. I mean, would Jesus know that he was God with his human nature, or would he have known it with his divine nature? Am I asking the question wrong? I mean, do you have any insight on that? I know that wasn't on the question list, but
No, that's okay. Well, I think when we look at the incarnation, Michael, we're thinking about the essence of Christianity. I mean, the incarnation, the Trinity first, and then the incarnation set us apart from both our Jewish friends and our Muslim friends.
Mhm.
And therefore, this is a truth that God took human flesh. I believe that Jesus understood his divinity, but I think as a human being, he developed in awareness. It's kind of mysterious. On one hand, he claims to be the great I am of the Old Testament. On the other hand, there are times he seemingly is working through his human nature, where he says, I don't know the timing of the second coming, or the Father is greater than I. But I think when you look at the biblical material, I think it indicates that Jesus had a unique awareness of his divinity, but he's a real human being. And the heresies, of course, either deny his divinity or deny his humanity. And, you know, orthodoxy teaches a single person with both a divine and human nature.
Yeah, thank you for taking that question. I think that's well answered. And I love to imagine what it would have been like to be like Jesus, to think that way, to know that truth about yourself, and yet to not use it and lord it over. I think of the great passage out of Philippians 2 to kind of illustrate that, which is just powerful, that he became like one who was a slave and, gave up emptied himself, kenosis in Greek. It's a great word.
And it seems like that was an ancient hymn that Paul weaved into the New Testament.
Yeah,
Remarkable.
I'm thankful for it. Well, I've highlighted some things I want to maybe come back to. I don't know if you have time to go a little bit beyond an hour. I don't know.
Oh, sure.
Few
Happy
minutes.
to.
Thank you. That would be great. Because I don't want to rush. And so I'd rather come back to a question rather than rush through it. So let's move on to chapter 4 for now. There's just something about doubt that I thought maybe some folks would want to hear about. But since we're on a roll and we're talking about mysteries, here's a question. In chapter 4 is, again, a question. If God created everything, then who created God? Now, you'll have to correct me because I haven't read Augustine in a while and I'm overdue. But wasn't it him that said, because he was asked that question, that God was thinking up hell to put people in for asking questions like that? Of course, he was joking, but was that Augustine?
That's right. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. There were people, interestingly enough, in his book Confessions, which is one of my favorite all-time books, Augustine talks a lot about creation because that's the context for living out the human life. And there were people in Augustine's time that said, what was God doing before he created the universe? And, the humorous comment is he was creating hell for those who pry into mysteries. But what's interesting, Michael, and I find this fascinating, that people like Paul Davies and other leading physicists actually say that Augustine had deep insight. He believed that time was created with the universe. And Davies has said, that's exactly what we believe as physicists. And so I was listening to a podcast in which Paul Davies was talking. He said, I was reading St. Augustine. I almost hit the car in front of me when I heard him say that. I thought, what in the world is this leading physicist reading a church father?
Right.
But again, creation ex nihilo reminds me a great deal of Big Bang cosmology. And how would Augustine know that the world was created in time, with time, rather than the other way around?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I wanted to come back to talking about if we can, because the Big Bang cosmology and its discoveries, I think, was mostly mid-20th century, I think.
Correct.
Yeah, I'd love to come back to talking about that because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what has been uncovered there. So if we can, let's come back to that. But this central question, such a great mysterious question, if God created everything, then who created God? Do we need to answer that question? And if so, how do we answer it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Bertrand Russell asked that question in a debate that he had. Uh, Stephen Hawking raises that question. Richard Dawkins raises that question. So the way I like to develop it is to say, look, if anything exists, and I think most of us are pretty confident of that, if anything exists, then something must be eternal, or something that wasn't eternal popped out of sheer nothingness. And then I look at both philosophy and science and theology, and I develop the idea that something coming into existence from sheer nothingness is not a rational proposition. And therefore we are kind of stuck with, well, if something does exist and everything we know now is contingent, dependent, then isn't it necessary to develop the idea that there is an eternal reality? But nothing in the universe, I mean, what I think interesting, Michael, is in the early part of the 20th century, most of the leading scientists thought the universe was eternal. You know, they had adopted largely an Aristotelian idea that maybe the universe is just there. But all of the great discoveries of the mid 20th century indicate the universe seemingly had an origin, that it had a singular beginning.
Yeah.
And even though there are people who question that now, that's still the basic cosmology that people have adopted in the scientific community.
That's big news, and therefore we can't work with the theory that the universe is eternal. And so if God is eternal, we would have to posit he would not require an explanation. We have to have an uncaused cause, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that idea of an infinite regress, and I'd simply say, look, well, you know, who created the universe? Well, God. Well, who created God? God squared. Well, who created God squared? God cubed. I mean, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas taught that's not going to work. There has to be an independent, a first cause, an uncaused cause. And if the universe doesn't fit that, I think we are reasonable in concluding there must be some other eternal explanation.
Yeah, and we have to look at the other lines of data too, I think, with ethics and aesthetics, and you know, we were talking about the intelligibility of the universe, and tie all these together. You know, that insight that you mentioned on its own is persuasive, but when you look at all of that, it points to God being the most rational explanation, because especially his personal quality, we'll get into that later. So I think that's very interesting. But why not just refer to the multiverse and say, well, you know, so what? Okay, so does gesturing toward the multiverse theory render the question of God's existence as moot? I mean, so what do we have here? This is a very popular explanation.
Yeah, so within the scientific community, people have said, look, we have all of these fine-tuning elements, but if we adopt a multiverse, that there's a near infinite number of universes, so there's going to be one of them that's going to have all of these qualities, and we just got really, 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 really lucky. I think there are lots of problems with that interpretation. One of them comes from people like Paul Davies and Ellis, who is a physicist, and that is there's no observational data that any of these universes exist at all. Paul Davies says it's faith. People are, you know, kind of trusting that this is the kind of circumstance. Moreover, I don't think we can get away from the idea that the universe is not past eternal, that it had a real beginning. And then, of course, you might even ask, well, does the multiverse require an explanation? And you know, if God exists, he could have created other realms. I mean, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century asked the question, could God create intelligent creatures in space? He says he didn't think it was probable, but he couldn't deny it. So I'm not sure the multiverse really provides any kind of broad explanatory, an explanation.
So even if there were other universes, parallel worlds, universes, then we would still have to go back to a singular explanation of how the multiverse came to be.
Yeah.
So, and sure, there are other Earth-like planets and, you know, different solar systems and different universes, and we would have to still posit an explanation for how that all came to be. So,
and Richard Swinburne says, why should I adopt a near infinite number of universes when a single God will provide a better explanation? Kind of, you know, Occam's razor.
sure, you're at the simplest explanation. And I think also I always like to quip that we have enough problems with our own.
Boy, oh boy. Yeah.
We don't need any more complexity than we already have. So speaking of, God again, you mentioned a lot of God's characteristics towards the end of chapter 4, and then we'll segue into 7, and then we'll see where we are as we turn the hour. Atemporal, uncaused, self-sustaining. A lot of these are very easy to understand for people: eternal, immaterial, ultimate, etc. Personal has always been one that's caused my students, when thinking about religion and philosophy of religion, trouble, because it sounds like we're calling God human, and well, wait, he was a human in Jesus. And so all this confusion begins to arise. What does it mean to say that the Christian God is personal? And would you even maybe comment, is Islam's view of God personal too? Because I think that's another.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that question. I've thought a lot about it because I care about it. In one way, I would say that Yahweh in the Old Testament is a personal God. I would say that Allah is perceived as a personal God. I would even be so bold to propose that in Christianity, God is super personal. And what I mean by that is he is a singular deity. So we affirm monotheism, but there is a diversity of persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So God is personal, but much more than that. He doesn't just have a mind and a will and can act as an agent, but God is super personal. And, Michael, what's interesting, I have become fond when I talk with Muslims and Jews and Jehovah's Witnesses. I ask them, you believe in a Unitarian view of God, one God, one person. I said, who did God love in eternity before he created angels and human beings? And what's interesting is I had a discussion with an imam about this. And I said, look, within the Trinity, God doesn't have to create to get love. God is fulfilled in himself. The Father loves the Son in the Spirit for eternity. So John can say in John 4:8 and 16 that God is love. And so to me, this is a very important point, Michael, because all of us want a God who is love, not a God who has to create to get it. Was he desperate? Was he not then fulfilled in himself?
Right.
But the idea that God is singular in essence, but plural in personhood, I think the Trinity is right at the heart of Christianity. And as Yaroslav Pelikan says, he says, you evangelicals talk too much about Jesus and you don't think enough about the Trinity. I don't know if you can talk too much about Jesus. There's a lot to talk about, but I do think you can be in a position where you don't think enough about the Trinity.
I think that's where I am, Ken, because I struggle with this. I believe it, but I struggle with it. And if I understand you correctly, in order for us to say that God is love, and that, we're not saying that they're the same, but love is an attribute that is part of God. That's what Christians mean when we say that. He has to have had a self-sustaining, necessary nature where we can justify that claim, right? But instead of with Islam, for example, perhaps Judaism, where he's Unitarian, he's alone unto himself, to say that God is love, which I would say he is loving, but it would be more difficult theologically to make the case there without the Trinity.
That's right. I mean, the imam, in my interaction with him, he said, well, God has a latent attribute of love that is only exercised after he creates. And I said, well, how do you have a latent? Does that mean he's somehow unfulfilled? Does that mean he can't exercise that? Again, I owe that to St. Augustine. Augustine raises the question about God being a God of love. And to me, that's very powerful. I think, and you know what, Michael, when I have taught that within the context of the church and to laymen, they become much more excited about their relationship with God. That when they think about the Trinity, they don't think about, some kind of difficult idea. They think, wow, God is analogous to a loving family.
Right. And that is something concrete that we can all imagine is so important. Yeah, I think this has given me a shot in the arm that I need as well to think more about this subject, because I confess, I think for me and many Christians, and maybe yourself over the years, it has a tendency to drift away as an abstract thought that, we don't anchor it in something concrete like a family. The analogy is very helpful here. So very, very great interfaith conversation sounds like you had there. Thank you for answering that. Now, as we finish, and this will probably be all we have time for, we'll have to have you on again. I think when
Thank you, Michael.
yeah, when we both have some more time, I would love to have you on again, perhaps later in the year. Um, I do want to get to these questions though, and I think this will be all we have time left, so we can let you go and enjoy the rest of your day as well. Chapter 7 is a really important chapter, and I know there are some other questions that you address, and I think chapter 6 about slavery I would have liked to get to, but this one, it seems to me, was really crucial. We talked about just war theory and whether, so chapter 7 is called What About Killing in the Name of God? I think people are very interested in this one. I know myself, I've struggled with this too. Is it Jesus, was he a pacifist, or was he a selectivist? Was he more of a proponent of defensive warfare? So this is a question that I've always struggled with. And you talk about the Crusades, but I think first, could we go and explain what a just war theory is and what, those different isms that you talk about are? And then
Yes.
we can talk about some other
Yeah.
things.
Well, obviously, war is a deeply ethical issue. I mean, Christians believe people are made in the image of God, and therefore to be in a position where we would intentionally take the life of another human being is a very critical moral issue.
Sure.
Uh, Early Christians within the first century and even a bit later, Christians tended to adopt a pacifism. They would kind of resist the Roman Empire, but they were often the object of persecution. By the time of Saint Augustine and others, they developed a philosophy because Christianity then had some influence. There were Christians in leadership. Christians were influencing the Roman world. Uh, Augustine developed just war theory, and it expanded later through others, Thomas Aquinas and various people. But it's essentially the idea that if you're going to engage in war, then it has to be a just war, and you have to engage in that war in a just manner. So not every war is a just war. Simply dominating people, taking their lives, their fortunes, and all of these things, a war can just be an immoral war. On the other hand, a just war could be conducted in an immoral way. And so Augustine raises questions like, for example, you have to be very careful not to target non-combatants. You have to be careful not to use excessive force. You also have to raise the questions, have you negotiated? Is this a last resort type of thing? And, I of course have read C.S. Lewis where he says, no, this is the reason I'm not a pacifist.
Right.
I think when you look, and again, I would relate it to my father's experience, Michael, right before my dad passed away, he looked me in the eye and he said, son, do you think God will punish me for killing those German soldiers? And my dad was a machine gunner in a rifle company. In fact, he received the Bronze Star because he inflicted a lot of casualties on the enemy. He kept the casualty rate low in his own company. And I remember him looking at me and I said, Dad, you helped stop the Holocaust. I said, I wish I had on my resume that I helped stop the Holocaust. So I think Christians have recognized that war can be evil and it is messy. And all of these questions are not easily answered. But I think Christians in history are to be applauded that they thought, if we're going to engage in this, we're going to try to develop some moral rules.
Yeah. Wow. It gets me thinking. When I was a kid, my grandfather died when I was just about 9, I believe, just short of that, or right after I turned 9. I remember asking him about his experiences in the war and taking his cigarettes. I think he smoked, maybe not Lucky Strikes. I can't remember what he was smoking those days, but I used to take them out of his pocket and throw them away.
Yeah, in World War II, there was Lucky Strikes and Camel.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah. Okay. So it probably was one of those two. And I would always ask him, and he would never talk about it. Of course, he was always gentle and sweet with me, but I wish I could ask him about this. And I wonder also what he thought. So it's a wonderful conversation you had with your dad, and very important question. So I think it's crucial that Christians look into this. And there's some verses in scripture where Jesus talks about packing a sword for the road. And I don't think he's saying to use it, but to have it in case of need of defense. So these are questions.
I mean, if people are made in the image of God and therefore have dignity and value to protect the innocent or to rescue people that are potentially in danger, you know, I affirm that there are times when we can engage in war. I mean, we couldn't have a police force if we adopted total pacifism.
Right.
But I also recognize that war can involve a lot of evil things. And so Christians
Certainly.
need to be diligent in thinking it through.
Absolutely. And, you know, we know to look carefully into wars like World War II, where many American and Allied soldiers committed atrocities, well-intentioned, you know, out of anger and outrage at what they had seen in the camps. But, you know, there was evil on both sides. And often, you know, we need to look and think carefully about that subject. So very, very good subject for us to reflect on. I want to finish with one last subject about religious pluralism, because this is another one of those sticky points for people. We believe that Christianity is the completely true way of seeing reality. That can put people off and make us seem that we're intolerant, maybe unloving, unkind. So my first question is, what is religious pluralism? Because this is a popular belief or an attitude today. And then how can we deal lovingly with that claim of Christianity when other people don't feel the same way?
And Michael, I think this is very important. I often like to say that I think a couple of the biggest challenges to our faith, one would be, how does faith relate to science? But I think equally important is how does the truth of Christianity relate to all these other religions?
Yes.
You know, religious pluralism, of course, says that all religions are true. Although I think if you look at, you know, people who have adopted this theory, I think in some sense, they're adopting a different position. But this is what I say about religious pluralism. One, there are real differences among the world's religions. I mean, some of the religions believe in one God. Hinduism has multiple ideas. You can be a monotheist and be a Hindu. You can worship 330 million gods as a Hindu, or you can believe the universe is God. So is God one? Is he more than one? Second, I don't think that there's really any way to reduce them all down to a common denominator. I mean, even ethics. It's true that Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, they all kind of have the second 5 of the 10 commandments. But in Christianity, our ethics flow from our theological convictions. I mean, we love our neighbor and treat our neighbor respectfully. Why? Because they are made in the image of God. So theology influences ethics. Then I think the third point that I want to make is this, that these views of God contradict one another. I mean, it's not just that they're slightly different, where you have secondary ideas like, should we baptize an infant or only adults? I mean, you're talking about the very nature of God. Is there one God or more than one God? Is God a person or something less or something more? Right. So I don't think it is intolerant or disrespectful to say that it's not reasonable to adopt the truth of all of these claims, because they are, and they're contradicting it. I like to say this, Michael. I like to say that I'm tolerant of people, but I'm intolerant of ideas that I think are faulty.
That line has stuck with me from your God Among Sages book. You know, I have to tell you, it's been a fill in the blank question on their homework for many years when talking about other religions, and they always love it, and it sticks with them, because we often collapse those two. You know, where we think an attack, or a better word would be a criticism of somebody's beliefs, is an assault on their character. And you say that that's not the case in that second to last chapter of God Among Sages. I think chapter 9, you go into it. So people should look at that book if they're interested in more. So I think that's such a crucial distinction to make. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, I think we've kept you long enough. Ken, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and your patience. I think people are going to love this episode. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate the work you do. You're so thoughtful. You are careful, And I hope many people will tune in and support what you're doing.
Thank you so much. It means a lot. Well, goodbye, everybody, and we hope to see you next time on Mythic Mission. And again, thanks for joining us, Ken.